Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Sunday morning. This is very different, isn't it? But I pray that you're there in your homes, maybe with one or two people or family members, and that you're able to listen to my message this morning and listen to and also I just want to share some announcements today. Obviously, we're in a time that has never been like any other time on the face of the earth. It's unprecedented, but here we go. Just to quickly let you know about some things happening in Port City. Rev Life Youth is happening this Friday. It's a groupies night. So all the youth, you can find the information on their Instagram page or on their Facebook page, the Rev Life pages. Also, life groups are still happening. We encourage you to be a part of the life group, attend. If you're not part of a life group, you can go on our website, portcitycc.org.au, and you will be able to email us or find the contact details to get in contact with us, or even if you wanted to come into the church through the week between the hours of 9 o'clock and 4 o'clock Tuesday through to Friday, and we'll be able to plug you into a group. The other thing that we wanted to let you know is giving. Some of you have asked us in regards to how do we give now? Well, some of you give online, so that won't be a problem. So that would be an opportunity for those who want to continue to give. We would encourage you to, please. You can appreciate we're still happening as a church. Things are still going forward. So you could then register to go online or get our bank details off our website, portcitycc.org.au, as I said. And you can find the bank details there on our webpage or on our Facebook page. You'll find bank details and you can use them to go online. If you need help with that, please ask a friend who understands how to do that, or come and ask us and we'll help you. And the last thing was our national executive, and particularly our president, Wayne Alcorn, has asked us to pray. So every day at 7 o'clock, if you could just pause for a moment wherever you may be, with your family, at home, at work, and just for a short moment, just pray. Pray for our nation as it faces this incredible challenge. Pray for our world as people are suffering. Pray for our community here as people are facing some difficulties with maybe loss of hours, loss of finance. Pray for each other. Pray for our church, that we'll continue to be able to move forward and push forward and function. I just want to let you know, Tuesday night we're praying from 7 till 8 here at the church, and we're going to have a worship. Some of the band here, we're going to spend some time in worship, and we're going to then pray. I might share just for a moment, and we're going to pray. So I invite you to come Tuesday night and be a part of that. That'd be great. So that is our announcements for this week. Can I just turn your attention to the message I want to share today, and I want to turn to Mark chapter 4, 35 to 41. Here we go. I'm reading from the New International Version. Mark chapter 4, verse 35. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along. That's talking about Jesus. The disciples took Jesus just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with them. Verse 37, a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Ouch. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up. He rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Well, this is a wonderful story. We see Jesus is asleep in a boat. And if we look at chapters, the previous chapter, that is chapter 3, and even the verses in chapter 4 leading up to this story, we can understand why he was in the boat asleep, because he had a pretty hectic pace, kept a pretty hectic pace the hours and the days before this, touching, healing many lives, feeding thousands, doing lots of things. And so it's no coincidence that he gets into the boat and what is a leisurely, sail across the Lake of Galilee. He fell asleep at the back on a cushion. It's interesting that the cushion would be mentioned because Matthew and Luke also mention this story and record the story of being Jesus in the boat who fell asleep. But Matthew records it in 5 verses. Luke records it in 4 because Luke's a doctor and he's very clinical. But Mark, he gives us a full description. He records it in 7 verses, and he talks about this Jesus being on a pillow. It kind of shows us Jesus' humanity, doesn't it? Even though he was totally God, the Son of God, he also had a human side. He got tired, and so in this case, he was asleep. And it's interesting because Jesus was still asleep when the storm broke, and that he still stayed asleep. He must have been very tired. So the story begins, of course, with Jesus saying something to the disciples that was very pertinent and very important, and that is, hey, we're going to go to the other side. I was just on the Lake of Galilee 2 months ago. I stood there on the bank and I looked across the other side, the 12 kilometres, that this part of the width of the Galilee was 12 kilometres across, and I could see very clearly the other side, which was Jordan. And on this side, I was near Capernaum, and I thought that, it looks very doable. And you'd wonder how a storm could blow up in the middle of this Lake of Galilee. But I was there another day, and the waves were crashing, and I thought, while it wasn't a massive storm, I thought, very much a storm could blow up in this place. And so the disciples are in the middle of the lake, and now we see a storm erupts around them. Okay, so that's the scene, and Jesus is still asleep in the midst of the storm. So let's look at some observations about this story, and I pray that that will be life-giving and encouraging and revelation truth to you today that you could apply to your life, particularly as we go forward in what's happening around us. And I suppose we could clearly say what's happening around us right at the moment is somewhat of a storm that we're living in. First thing about this observation in this story is storms happen even with Jesus in the boat. We can think, well, I'm right, I'm a believer in God. Everything's going okay, and if I'm a believer in God, there shouldn't be that many problems. But the reality is that life happens, and when it rains, we all get wet. Whether we have a great belief in God or we don't have a belief in God, life unfolds, doesn't it? Situations unfold. It mightn't be your fault or problem that you're in the situation. We certainly know that what we face at the moment in the sense of coronavirus is not something you and I have instigated, but it's happened and it's affecting our lives. It's affecting the way we do life. It's affecting our everyday life. It's affecting the way we shop. It's affecting even church life, isn't it, in some ways? So it's happening, it's unfolding. And in the midst of this, the disciples, in the midst of the storm, wake up Jesus. And they say, hey, Jesus, you're in our boat. Now, they don't say this, but they kind of imply this. You're in our boat. We just saw you just 1 chapter ago, heal the sick, do miraculous things, and the compassion you showed for people was incredible. And yet here we are, we're in the boat with you, and we're about to drown? Come on, don't you? And the question was asked by them, don't you care for us? You've got to understand, the disciples only became the disciples in chapter 3. This is chapter 4 now, this storm's erupted. So the disciples didn't know Jesus all that well, and so they'd seen him have great compassion on others, and they're wondering whether he has compassion on them now, whether he really cares for them. And the question they say is, don't you care? That's a good question. That's a good question for all of us. I think you should ask God that question. I think you should sincerely ask God that question. God, do you care for me? And just wait for the answer. Don't just rush into life. Let him show you how much he cares. If you're sincere and you take some steps towards God, you'd be surprised how many steps he takes towards you and proves his love and compassion for you. You see, he did that for the disciples. And I think all of us at different times in our life want to know, does anyone care? Does anyone care what I'm going through? Does anyone care about my situation? I'd like to say to you this morning, could you settle it in your heart that Jesus does care? He has always cared and will always care for you. Consider what he went through, if you would, for a moment, when he was on this earth, and how he ultimately submitted himself to a Roman cross and was nailed there and died. His blood was shed, his body was broken, and the interesting whole thought of that, of course, is he'd done it for you and me, so that the sins of people could be forgiven. You would remember, of course, that the way the Jewish people dealt with sin was they sacrificed the lamb in the temple, and the blood was shed, the body was broken. But now Jesus, of course, is doing it. Jesus is doing it for us, and we see that that is the way that sins can be forgiven, by asking for Jesus' forgiveness, repenting of our old ways of life, and receiving what he's done for us. And so the question is, does Jesus care? Of course he cares. He cares incredible for us. And why don't you give him a chance to prove that to you? The truth is that the disciples were in the midst of the storm, and they're asking this question. And we can be in the midst of our storm, as we all are, and we've asked the question, Jesus, do you really care for my ill health? Do you care today for my grief, my pain, my storm? It's a good question, and I believe Jesus very much does care. I do believe that in the midst of what we face, there can be a purpose in this. Now, I don't think God's done this to us. I think mankind has brought this whole problem of coronavirus upon ourselves in the way we live. But the truth is, God can use it, purpose it in our lives that would draw us closer to himself, so that we would trust him, that we would run into him and not run away from him. So storms happen in your boat. Storms happen in your life, even with Jesus there. Even as a strong believer, you can have things happen. If you were to look at some Old Testament stories, you remember Daniel we used to worship and pray to God 3 times a day, and the king at the time said, Daniel, don't stop that, you've got to worship me. Daniel said, I can't do that because it's not right. And he says, you'll go into a lion's den. He says, oh well, take me and put me in the lion's den. I've got to trust my God. And Daniel went into the lion's den, and God was with him and shut the lions' mouths, and Daniel came out alive. So very much we see God is there in our storms. God was there in the lion's den. God will be with us if we would just ask him and draw near to him. See, there's another train of thought I want to give you, an observation about this whole boat trip and the storm. There is a lot of difference today between being soaked and being sunk. These guys were just soaked. The waves were breaking over the sides of the boat. The boat was filling up with water. They were very wet, but they weren't drowning, even though they felt like they were going to drown. And don't we feel that way sometimes? We're going under for the last time, when really what's happening is we're just very wet, but we're not destroyed. We're still alive, we're still breathing. It's imperative that we understand the difference between being soaked and being sunk. Don't get them confused, because what would happen is our storms would sometimes scream at us, you're finished, give up, you're never going to make it. And yet, when you really just calm your heart, calm your thoughts, calm your mind, you're facing some struggles. We all are at the moment, but we're not drowned. We're not destroyed. We're just wet. We're not sunk. I think it's important. The truth is, we all, right now, as I said, are wet in that sense. If I use the analogy, we're all wet. We're all facing the realities of what has happened in our world in these last month and a half. Our routine of church has changed, obviously. Our shopping has changed. How we do shopping. I was actually at the shops through this week. I went at 7 o'clock to Drake, just running a bit low on the old toilet paper, as many of you are. And I went in there at 7 o'clock, went to the toilet aisle where the toilet paper was, and was able to. They were allowing us to purchase 1 roll. And I thought, you know what? I'll be thankful for the one. I grabbed the one roll, I went out and paid for it. One roll is better than no rolls. So we're all wet. That's not my routine, to get up at 6:30 and get to the shop by 7 and to buy stuff. But that's what's happening, isn't it? Sometimes you've just got to adjust in the midst of these challenges. I know that our enemy, the devil, will lie to you at these times and say you're sunk. Everything's going to go from bad to worse. But I want to tell you, don't give up. Realize God says to you, don't listen to the lie, because if you listen to the lie, you'll start to think, well, I'm going to die. I'm going to, not literally, but this is the end. This is something bad. No, we've just got to realize that if we look at the reality of the situation, we're just really, really wet right now, and we're not sunk. That's the truth of the moment. And this is a time when we don't need to lift our hands in frustration, even though God doesn't mind us. We talk to Him in frustration, but we maybe need to lift our hands in admiration to Him and be in amazement of our God. See, the last thing that the enemy wants you to do is to lift your hands in prayer to God, to lift your hands in admiration to Him, to lift your voice, because what he wants you to do is just get frustrated, get angry, get anxious, get worried, get concerned, and because if we do that, we'll be prayerless. We won't be effective. But He wants us to turn that around today and just realize. So we're not sunk yet, and we're not going to be, I don't believe, if we're just a bit wet. Here's the third thing. What has your attention? Has your life? Let me finish with this. You see, in the midst of this extreme storm, these were seasoned fishermen. Okay, they've been in storms before, I'm sure, on the Lake of Galilee, but they're fearing for their lives. Jesus is asleep soundly in the back of the boat, in the stern of the boat, and in the midst of this situation. And sometimes we can ask that question in the midst of our heartache, in the midst of our grief, in the midst of our pain, in the midst of our hurt, in the midst of our trial. Can we still live in rest? Can we still have peace? Because Jesus certainly was asleep. He was at peace. The storm is crashing around Him, and yet He can still be peaceful. He can still be at rest. I find that quite incredible. I think Jesus gives us this picture. Well, both Matthew, Mark and Luke give us this picture of the reality that we have a Saviour, we have a leader, we have a man called Jesus who can sleep in the midst of the storm. It's interesting that when Jesus finally wakes up, He looks at the disciples and He's honest with them. He says, do you still have no faith? Maybe today, through the situations you feel like, maybe you feel like one of those disciples got faith, because the word faith here means small faith. That's what, if you translate it, you'll see that it means actually small faith. Jesus says, why have you such little or small faith? And maybe today we feel a little that way, like we just got such small faith, that our faith is not a lot of it. But I want to encourage you, just with a little bit of faith, just a mustard seed of faith, God can do amazing things. If we would submit and commit that little bit, it's amazing how God can grow us and strengthen us if we would just ask Him and trust Him. And really, this picture of the disciples and Jesus and the boat and the storm is a picture of you and me. It says they feared exceedingly, or a better translation is they were in awe. What were they in awe and wonder and astonishment and amazement of? Well, at one stage, they were in awe and amazement and fearful, I should say, of the storm itself. Remember, they were fearful of it. They thought they were going to drown. And yet, when Jesus stands up and He says to the storm, be still, the storm completely calms down. The waves drop out of it. The wind drops off. And then they turn their attention from the amazement of this storm that is so cyclonic, so bad, and yet they turn to face Jesus, and now they're in awe of Him. I find that incredible. I find that wonderfully refreshing and encouraging. See, I know that the storm, coronavirus, and everything else that's happening around our life wants your attention, wants your awe, wants you to be distracted with it, wants you to be consumed with it. And while we will certainly have to deal with this on a day-to-day basis, all of us, and what's happening now, please don't let it consume you. Please don't let it take your attention to the point where you stop normal life and functions. And I know many of you won't, but don't allow that concern and worry to grip your heart, because the truth is that it wants to captivate you. Once it captivates you, it wants to consume you. It wants to take your mind and put it firmly on that all the time. And I was just as I said, I was in the supermarket this week and a couple times actually, and as I went along checking the toilet roll aisle, and there was a couple rolls that were left, and this lady walked up, and she picked up one, and in the frustration, she just, not in a loud voice, but I was close enough to hear her, she says, "Well, that's useless," and she walked away, probably angry out of the concerns in her own heart. And I thought, lady, why don't I walked up and I took the one, and I said, God, I'm not better than her, I've got no great, but I just know the God that holds me in the midst of this storm. And as I took that one, I just said, Father, I'll take the one, and I'll be thankful for the one toilet roll. The one toilet roll. And where does that thought and that thankfulness come from in the midst of a pretty challenging time right now? I want to say it comes from God. And you know what? To be thankful like that just creates such a peace in your heart. And I thought, I'm not going to let this thing consume me. I'm not going to get angry. I'm not letting it control my emotions. No, I'm just going to be thankful and praise Him. And so we see the disciples, they were consumed by the storm, and now they're anxious, they're worried by the storm, and now they're in awe of Jesus, who can still the wind and the waves. What an incredible example Jesus is to us. They asked the question, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey Him? They were in awe of Him. Maybe another good question we could ask, that maybe someone needed to ask in the middle of the storm when Jesus was asleep, is this: who is this that even the wind and the waves don't wake Him? Don't wake Him. That He could have so much peace in the midst of this storm, that He would be asleep and stay asleep. And I find that incredible. We can be so captivated by the storm and the problem that we have no room to have love and awe and admiration for our God and praise for our God. I want to tell you, when you give thanks and praise and start to worship Him, like we're going to do this Tuesday night, I tell you what, the storm becomes pretty small compared to how big our God is. It says in the Word of God, "Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt His name together." The word magnified really means this: to make Him bigger than the problem. Make Him bigger. Magnify. Get a magnifying glass and say, our God is so big. I tell you, when David was about to kill Goliath, little David with his slingshot and stones, of course the Israelite men said, he's too big to fight. And David said, he's too big to miss. And so I think that's the attitude we need to have. Our storm isn't big compared. This whole thing that's happening in the world is nowhere near as big as our God. And that's what the disciples finally, their conclusion was. See, our storm is happening right now. I acknowledge that. We're not sunk, we're just wet. Get your mind off the wind and waves. Get your mind off the storm and get your mind back on the one who says we're going over to the other side. Because when Jesus makes a promise, His promise stands. You know what? This week I've had disruptions. In this week, disruptions, but completely my week has completely been, let's be honest, turned upside down, completely changed. And there's moments when I've been wondering what I should do and what we should do, and I've had some anxious moments, but I've just had to remind myself, come back, and look at Jesus and not the storm. And the truth is, His promise was to me, hey, you're going to the other side. And some of you had plans this week. And in a sense, in the an analogy, you were going somewhere, you were going to the other side. But the truth is you didn't get there, or it didn't happen like you thought it would. In actual fact, 8 months ago, I was invited, this week, I was invited by our state team pastors to come and join them with a bunch of other pastors for a little day seminar down in the Brisbane area. And Michelle and I had booked our flights and booked our we were going to go, and we're really looking forward to it because they're going to have some very good speakers just for 24 hours. And we cancelled it, and because in the end some things happened that we felt we couldn't go, and there's some things that we thought were definite roadblocks that we didn't need to go. I was disappointed, but I thought I was going there this week. I didn't get there. That's okay, because a storm blew up and it disrupted that. But I'm glad I was here so that I could be here for the body of Christ and people. And the reality is with Jesus, even though I didn't get to the other side and what I wanted to do, when you're with Jesus, when He promises you're going to the other side, I tell you, you can believe it even when the storm wants to stop you. So be encouraged. Hey, let's continue to move forward in faith. Let's continue to encourage one another to live closer to Jesus, living for Him, looking for Him, knowing Him every day. Thank you. And have a wonderful Sunday. And if we don't see you through the week, I'll be seeing you next Sunday. Bye-bye.